Hello, and welcome back to Mr. B Teaches History. Today we will examine the ways that even though the states were united as a nation, they were still largely divided into distinct regions. Today we will turn our attention to the region of the southern states where slavery reigned. So let's get to it. Southern planters built their agricultural empires around cash crops like tobacco, rice, sugarcane, indigo, and the largest of the 1800s, cotton. Cotton drove most of the economic and cultural action of the South. The creation of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 revitalized the crop and made it profitable again to grow since it took much of the tedious manual labor out of the process. Factories both in Great Britain and the United States relied on the cotton crops to feed the textile mills to make fabric. Cotton also spurs western migration in the South because cotton depletes the soil very quickly, so farmers need to find fresh sources of ground to grow the crop on since the demand for the product and the price is very high. Wealth in the South was measured both in land and slaves. Typically, the more land you had, the more slaves you owned. Many people in the South defended the slave system from a religious and historical perspective. Slavery increased during the 1800s despite the ban on the importation of slaves in 1808. The investment made by slave owners and the society in the slave system lessened the investment they could have made in industry. The condition of life for slaves varied greatly depending on the location of the slaves. Generally, though, the further north you were, the better off they had it. Also, generally, many families were separated over time, and women were vulnerable to sexual exploitation and rape by their masters and others. Education and movement was generally restricted due to the fear of revolts like those of Denmark Vesey in 1822 and Nat Turner in 1831. These revolts were often quickly and violently put down and usually led to the state tightening the slave codes in that region. If a slave could not revolt, they found other ways to revolt nonviolently, like slowing down their work, sabotaging their equipment, or escaping to the north. Despite the hardships of slave life, there was a strong sense of family and religious faith within the slave communities of the South. Not all blacks in the South were slaves. Most free blacks in the South lived in the cities and owned property, including sometimes black slaves. But let's be honest, they were not in any way equal to whites when it came to their social, economic, or political rights. For instance, they were barred from some jobs and generally could not vote. Also, they had to keep papers on them to show that they were free blacks, but this did not always guarantee that they would not be kidnapped and sold into slavery. Free blacks stayed in the South for a variety of reasons. First, sometimes they wanted to stay near family that were still in bondage. Secondly, they thought the South as their home and did not want to leave. And lastly, because sometimes opportunities in the North were not much greater due to racial prejudice, discrimination, and racism. White society in the South was a rigid socioeconomic class structure and hierarchical. At the top were the aristocracy with over 100 slaves and thousands of acres of land. These men generally dominated in the state and local governments. Below them were farmers or planters who usually had less than 20 slaves and several hundred acres of land. Generally, they worked in the fields with their slaves. Below them were the poor yeoman farmers who had no slaves but defended the system due to the feelings of white supremacy and superiority over their free and enslaved blacks. These people made up 3/4 of the population in the South. Lastly, below them were the mountain people who lived in isolated areas and disliked planters and slaves. The South did have cities, but they were limited and smaller when compared to the North due to the agricultural focus of the region. The culture of the South focused on a code of chivalry of the aristocratic planters who had paternalistic or fatherly attitudes to both women, slaves, and anyone they deemed inferior. The black codes and slave laws existed to protect women from the savage blacks. Generally, only these rich aristocrats got any education, and slaves generally were forbidden from learning how to read and write. Slavery was so ingrained into the culture of the South that it divided church memberships in national denominations, with both the Methodist and Baptist churches having distinct northern and southern congregations split on the issue of slavery. Those churches in the South that support the abolition of slavery often had their memberships decline. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or clarifications you would like to make about this lecture, please leave a comment below. If you learned something new, please consider leaving a like.
If you would like to receive notifications of more content like this, please consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell. If you would like to support this channel and creator financially, please check out the links in the description for merchandise or sites that will provide me direct financial support for the work of this channel. Thank you for your time and have a great day. Class dismissed.